Okay, hello everybody. We're going to start and let people come in because in just over an hour, the Baroness Worthington, and I got taught, John, you should have told me this, she's the only Baroness Worthington, so she would not be the Baroness Worthington of Cambridge, she would be the Baroness Worthington. Will be led by Richard Wex, who just arrived, into the chapel.
With my gown, I see.
With her, for her admission as our newest honorary fellow. And we are absolutely delighted to have Bryony as an honorary fellow. She is a British environmental campaigner. She sits in the House of Lords, although she is on leave. She's the founder of Sandbag, now member. She currently resides in California, co-hosts a very popular podcast called Cleaning Up, in which she interviews leaders in the energy sector, climate, and some others. She's a very effective campaigner, and she just agreed to help the University of California in Santa Cruz with developing the Center for Climate Coastal Resilience. She read English literature here at Queen's and has had an impactful career that has included government, business, NGOs. And she was the lead author for the UK's 2008 Climate Change Act, widely regarded as a landmark legislation. So we are absolutely delighted to have you here. Thank you for being here.
Well, thank you, Mohamed. It's a delight to be back.
What's it like being back?
Well, it's beautiful. I mean, if it was like this, I wouldn't be in California.
So here's the plan. Here's the narrative arc. We're going to talk a little bit about her time at Queen's, her career, her role in the energy transition, advocacy, and what's ahead. We're going to do that for about 40 minutes to allow 20 minutes of questions from you. But before we go to Queen's, you were elevated at the age of 39 to the House of Lords. What's it like joining the House of Lords at 39?
Well, I mean, it was quite a moment. But it coincided with almost exactly to the same week as the birth of my first child, my son. So I like to joke that it was 2 life sentences in 1 week. And so that whole period of my life was intermingled with these 2 new roles of being a mother and then being elevated into the House of Lords far too young, and just feeling a little bit at sea in general with these 2 changes. But it was actually brilliant because it gave me a dual focus, and I think being a mother is wonderful, but it can be all consuming, and I had this other thing that I had to keep learning, and I like being on a very steep learning curve, and learning the ropes of the House of Lords is quite an experience, especially when you have all of Thatcher's ex-cabinet, lined up in front of you, glaring at you. Nigel Lawson was a really big, powerful force in the House at that time, and I was, kind of an arch enemy supporting green issues and climate change. So it was a baptism of fire. I made fantastic friends, including Lord Eatwell, who introduced me into the Lords, and I loved it. It was incredible.
So there's lots of pictures of you taking your baby into the House of Lords, and you said very nice things about the reception you got. Did you really get such a favourable reception?
I did, actually, and Neil Kinnock and Glynis Kinnock were brilliant. They taught me a trick that to vote in the House of Lords, you have to physically walk through a corridor, and you're not allowed to take a baby through the chamber into the corridor. And they said, and don't worry about it, girl, just sit in the right bit of corridor, wait for them to call. Because we're all whipped, so you know whether you're voting yes or no. You know which corridor you should be in. So I sat in the right corridor, the doors were closed, I had my baby with me, and we voted. So it was a good trick. But I did get lots of comments about, oh, you're voting, 1.5 of you are voting today. It was quite a lot of hilarity about it. But they were brilliant. They were very accommodating. I have no complaints.
And then you went in as a Labour peer, and then you decided to be a crossbencher.
Yes.
Why?
Well, I as I tend to do, I sort of threw myself at it, and I kind of asked lots of questions and got involved, and I was made a shadow minister fairly soon. I was a whip and then a shadow minister with energy, and I took 2 bills through, and it was incredibly exciting and interesting in opposition. Of course, this is not as a government minister, but as a shadow minister. But then I think I got a bit burnt out, if I'm honest, and I also wanted I thought I needed a bit more of an international perspective. So I came off as a minister and decided to join a US-based NGO, and they gave me an opportunity to set up their European branch. And one of the conditions of that was, we probably need you to be neutral. It's, for our purposes, you shouldn't really be party political. So I decided to become a crossbencher.
Tell us about the caucus that you're part of on the environment there.
Well, one of the things that we did, Nigel Lawson, I can't overestimate how impactful Nigel Lawson was on general mood in the House of Lords at the time, was that, well, Nigel's told us there isn't a problem, so it's fine. And so, there was this kind of feeling that people were being probably not very well informed, or there was a need for more solidarity across the benches. So we, together with Baroness Helene Hayman, who was universally respected by everyone in the House, we created a caucus called Peers for the Planet, and we started recruiting peers into that to help them ask questions, learn, be exposed to new ideas. And I think it's up to 150 strong now. And when I left it in Helen's capable hands, she took it on, and we had staff employed, and we became a kind of anomaly. It wasn't an all-party parliamentary group. It was just a group of like-minded peers.
We're going to come back to discuss your incredible work in this area, but I want to go back a little bit earlier to Queen's. So you're doing English literature here.
Yes.
If I had asked you then, what will you be doing at 39? What do you think you would have told me?
Definitely not going into the House of Lords. In fact, if you'd asked my wonderful friends that I made here who was most likely to go into the House of Lords, it wouldn't be me. It was totally unexpected, really. And because I had a natural curiosity and a sort of I wasn't politically active, and I really wasn't even really very keen on green issues or environmental issues. I came here at quite a difficult time in my personal life, and I really found the community here incredibly supportive, and I was just trying to get through. I think a lot of people, and I came from a comprehensive school in Wales. I was the first member of my family to attend university, let alone Cambridge. So I just wanted to get through, and I was incredibly supported in that. But I didn't have any grand plan, or I had a general curiosity and an interest in how the world worked, but there were no signs that I would become...
And your first job out of university?
Well, I went travelling after university. I think if you go back to one of the yearbooks, you'll see it says Bryony's going to sail around the world, because I didn't know what to put down, so I thought I'll do that. I hadn't been on a boat at that point, so I did have to go and learn to sail. And then I did sail halfway around the world, so that was my first thing after uni.
That's amazing. Okay, then you transition slowly into environmental issues.
Yes, yeah.
So what was the catalyst? How did it happen?
Well, going back to my childhood in Wales, I'd always had a love of nature, and it was really conservation, and particularly marine conservation. I grew up in the tail end of the fight to save the whales. I mean, that's how old I am. And the whaling story is a really amazing story of the world coming together and realising that we shouldn't collectively allow this travesty to happen, where we're losing these amazing species. So I had this passion for nature, and one of my jobs after university was working with a group of wildlife groups who were trying to change laws to increase the protection of wildlife. And actually, during that period, I had that first taste of how you can change laws relatively straightforwardly if you get the right question asked by the right person at the right time. So I handed a question to ask an amendment to a minister to a bill which would stop the reckless harassment of cetaceans, and to my surprise, the Minister of the day, Michael Meacher, said, "Oh, that's a very sensible amendment, we'll adopt that." And I was like, oh my goodness, I've just changed the law of the land. And I was in my 20s at this point, so it was quite intoxicating. But then I was involved in a conversation about these laws that we were passing to preserve nature and wildlife, and probably an English nature scientist said, well, all of this is meaningless because climate change is going to mean all of these lines on maps we're drawing are probably going to be useless. And I remember thinking, well, what? I better find out more about that then. So that's when my interest in climate began. Okay, keep going. And therefore? Well, and therefore, because I'd been working with all these wonderful groups, were asking for new laws for wildlife, one of which was Friends of the Earth. And Friends of the Earth back then was a force to be reckoned with. They're an incredibly influential organisation. And I knew them, and I thought, if I want to work anywhere on climate, I want to work with them. So I waited for the right job to come up, and I then got that job. So my first job in climate was for Friends of the Earth. And then being curious and data-driven, I went into the details of why were our emissions of greenhouse gases in the UK bouncing up and down. They'd been on a declining curve throughout the Conservative era, actually, because we'd been shifting from coal for lots of reasons. It wasn't well handled, but the emissions were going down. And then Labour came in, and suddenly that trend stopped, and our emissions were bouncing around. And it was really the relative cost of coal versus gas that was determining how much carbon we burnt. And I thought, right, we need to do a campaign around getting the externalities of coal brought in. But Friends of the Earth, in their wisdom, said, that's all very well and good, thank you, you've got the job, but we want you to start by campaigning to close nuclear power down. And I was too young to know any different, so I did do that for a bit, but anyway,
okay,
get on to that.
So you change your views on nuclear power?
Oh yes, absolutely, yeah, yes.
Tell us about that evolution.
So I think ability to admit you're wrong and look at the data again and move when you learn new things, move your opinion is a strength. And so after I'd left Friends of the Earth, and I had a bit of time off with my husband in Canada, and he was on an academic placement in Canada, I'd spent a summer looking into nuclear power on my own, doing my own research and going through source documents and watching all these incredible videos of Chernobyl and trying to really understand how big a risk this was. And I concluded that it was, yes, there were risks, but it was no greater risk than a normal industrial process that also carried risks, need to be well managed, but we had blown it out of all proportion, given that it was a clean source of power and that it was manageable, and that, I know this is going to sound a bit glib, and but there are much more risky things that we do on a day-to-day basis. And when it comes to climate risk, you've got to look at the benefits of nuclear afresh. And also, nuclear is not a monolith. There's many ways of doing nuclear. It's not just one technology. There's different reactor designs, different fuel cycles, different coolants. And that whole area of innovation in nuclear was just starting up. And I was quite convinced we'd find a safer way of doing it.
And given how public you had been about this issue, how hard was it walking it back?
Well, to be honest, I'm not a great placard waving campaigner. So when they asked me to do the whole anti-nuclear stuff, I stayed in the background and let the campaigners do that. So I never was associated strongly with the anti-nuclear movement. So it wasn't too, and also I was just but we've missed a bit, which is when I was campaigning for new laws on climate change.
Right.
And so I was more associated with that than being anti-nuclear.
Okay. On law, tell us about the 2008 legislation.
Yes, the quick version is I wrote it twice. Once as a campaigner, where myself and Martin Williams, who was head of the political division of Friends of the Earth, decided we needed a law to constrain these emissions that were bouncing around, and that we should come up with one. And he literally, I think, drew a bit of stuff on the back of an envelope, and we decided we needed a trajectory of emissions to be put in law. And I liked the idea of these carbon budgets, which were 5-yearly budgets that would go down over time. So we quickly drafted up what we thought looked like a reasonable piece of legislation. And so that was the first time. And then I had left Friends of the Earth after a while, that campaign gaining ground, and it gained ground very quickly throughout the 2000s. And then by the time it had reached a crescendo where David Cameron was promising a climate change act if he got elected, and Tony Blair was under pressure, and Gordon Brown, David Miliband got made the Secretary of State for Environment, and he was a man on a mission and had the kind of heft within the cabinet to make things happen. And he said, okay, I'll deliver a climate change act. Looked around his department, and I was there on secondment, and said, well, you know something about this, come on, let's all get together and we'll start drafting this, and it will take you, I'm giving you 6 months from start to finish, which the civil servants and the lawyers said that's impossible, we'll never get it done. But David was David, and we got it through, and it was published, I think, in 2003, 2004, and then it went through its normal process and then became law in 2008.
And how impactful do you think it has been?
Well, it's been copied. So we always said, when we were talking to Treasury and others who were saying this is suicide, we shouldn't do it, that, well, if we don't lead, who will? And if we do lead, others will follow. So it'll be a race to the top, not a race to the bottom. And I'm glad to say that there's been scores of countries now pass similar framework legislation, and they've copied some of the elements. So I think it's been influential in that way. And then in terms of UK, my favourite thing is that we had this brilliant grade 3 civil servant, Robin Mortimer, who was overseeing the project. And he had all these clever ideas of putting in these legal it's like a legal metronome that the government can't escape. If they have to do something by this day and they have to do something by this day, and it keeps going. So even when British politics was at its most crazy, with Boris Johnson stabbing Gove in the back and it was all madness, they still had to publish the 4th and 5th carbon budgets, because if they didn't, they'd have been sued by the general public. So even when, and that's what we wanted. We wanted the day-to-day craziness of politics to be taken aside, and that the climate issue would persist, and that there would have to be action whatever was happening. And that's what it's done.
We're going to come back to the craziness of politics and what it does to the climate crisis.
Yes.
But before that, we have a lot of students with us. And you worked in government, you worked in advocacy, you've worked in business,
Yep.
You've advised all sorts of people. What's it like doing all this? And what do you do when they don't align?
Well, I mean, I have tried a lot of hats on, so if anyone wants any thoughts on which was the most impactful. And I mean, I've sort of been a civil servant. I've worked in the private sector for an energy company. I set up my own NGO. I've worked for big NGOs. I've done a stint in philanthropy. And actually, in each case, it's often the circumstances, the context that you're in that enables you to perform. And in a way, that's a combination of you having the sort of energy and the drive to try and make change happen, but then sometimes things just align, and it is luck, actually, that enables you to be in the right place at the right time and have that impact. And in a way, knowing that, you can slightly relax. It's not all on you as an individual, and it almost never is an individual. It's a community of people, and then the context that they're in. And I think I've just been very lucky that I've kept finding myself in places where that interlocking of the right context, the right people has come together. But I suppose what I would say is that they've each got their different characteristics. But I think my favourite time was in the civil service, because it had that feeling of when you get the right minister with the right agenda, you can really make things change. And then if I had to choose a second, it would be in the private sector, where working for an energy company, having been at Friends of the Earth, was such a stark contrast. And what I loved about it was these were people who got up every day and built things and made things and changed things and moved quickly. And there was an alignment at that time with policy, so they were building the right things and they were doing it quickly, and that was really good.
So if someone were to try to figure out why it is that you were so impactful in different worlds, often completely competing worlds, what characteristics, what has made you so adaptable and impactful, do you think?
I think a curiosity and bravery combined. So I'm quite up for a challenge. So the entry into the House of Lords was probably one of the most challenging, but I just decided, look, there's no point in being here and sitting in the sidelines, go for it. And it took a certain amount of courage, actually, and it was quite terrifying at the start, but then I did it more and it got less terrifying. And I suppose, yes, bravery is a funny quality. I don't know how, it's not something you get trained in, but I'm generally pretty open to taking on a
Have you ever fallen
risk.
flat on your face?
Oh, well, countless times.
So what does it take to get back up?
Well, that's a good, and resilience, really, isn't it? It's just that feeling that, okay, dust yourself off, you've learned something, and go at it again, yeah. Okay,
you also are founder of a startup.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, now that I'm in Silicon Valley, I've become infected with this mindset that everyone's got to do a startup at least once in their life. So it's the era of AI, right? So we are using AI tools and big data to just track political discourse. But we've started with the European Parliament in the UK, where we can ingest large amounts of data of what an elected representative has said, and then we can give it a relevance score, and we can tell, we can give a world vision. You can give an agent a world vision, and you can say, how far is this discourse from the way I see the world? And you can track what's happening over time. So you can see I care about climate change. Is that becoming more polarized? Are we seeing more extremist voices? What arguments are being used? And so that this ability for now to democratize access to what's going on in our democracy really interests me. Now, I'm not sure that it's not a hugely commercial startup, but I'm enjoying the process of learning about these tools, what their strengths are, what their quirks are, and then applying it to something I care about. And I've always said if I wasn't working on climate change, I'd be working on preserving democracy. So this is a good overlap.
So let's do data, let's do the AI agent, and let's do impact. Data. Is it just an EU thing, or can you generalize that to other places?
At the moment, we can ingest parliaments that have an open transcription of what goes on. So in Europe, it's very open. UK is very open. There's an API that you can access the data through. But we've done initial research for about 20 parliaments that you could do this for, including many of the US.
And
states.
the similarities are.
And then if and when we can get to that scale, I mean, I have to. Please don't get the wrong impression. It's like 3 of us and a very small budget. But we theoretically could then get a kind of global dashboard of watching political discourse shifting over time, and then I think that helps to inform risk, and I think there'll be customers who care about this kind of risk, maybe some of your customers. And in economics, it will have an impact on economics.
And the AI engine?
Well, we have an agnostic AI, we dock into OpenAI at the moment because it's the best that we've found. But we can use
what has surprised you in terms of what the agent, if you like, the AI agent allows you to do and doesn't allow you to do? And what's to worry about hallucination in your world?
Well, the speed with which it's getting better is quite alarming. Well, it's not alarming, it's actually quite incredible. What we realised was that you do have to have a human in the loop, and feedback mechanisms that give it thumbs up, thumbs down, so that it can learn. But it's been incredible. To crack one of the aspects of the European Parliament, we had to do video to transcription because it doesn't have a written transcription that's available. So we were learning how good it is at spotting faces, and actually, surprisingly, MEPs' photos are not what they look like in real life. So you have to build up a range of photographs, and if they've got their glasses on, or if they've had a bad day and they're a bit hungover, whatever, the AI does struggle a bit, or some random person says something and then it gets confused. So you have to guide it. It's like having a very enthusiastic intern, but it needs guiding.
And you know enough about the underlying algorithms to.
No, well, someone on the team will, but it is a black box, right? By and large, but the outputs have been quite extraordinary. And the other, sorry to go on about this, but the other thing you can do is if you then wanted to engage with an elected representative, you could ask it, well, tell me a bit about Bryony Worthington's way of speaking. What would she be interested in? How would I frame something? And it's brilliant at that kind of.
Okay, so let's talk about impact. What sort of clients do you have that use it?
Well, we have 3 clients, and they are all in the climate space, and they are looking at ranging from electric vehicles to energy storage to the built environment. So we've found really close friends who want to see if they can improve their impact.
And what sort of questions are they asking?
They want to know, is the sentiment shifting, and also who should we speak to? Like, who are our allies, who are not aligned, and who are the people in the middle that we could actually influence? It's very hard to change the minds of really dyed-in-the-wool skeptics, but you're trying to inoculate the middle. That's what you're always trying to keep things in the centre.
And in your wildest dreams, what does this look like in 5 years' time?
Well, someone told me yesterday that if we don't get it to scale in a year, we're going to be toast because everything's moving so fast, and we're not the only people who've thought of this business model. And in 5 years' time, it would be amazing if we had, let's say 20, 25 parliaments that were able to ingest and offer a service that actually turns over a profit of some kind. At the moment, we're massively in debt. So,
Okay. So I want to spend the next 10 minutes before we open it up for questions from all of you to talk about this special moment in time.
This special moment in time in the context of the world, you mean?
In the context of the world.
Not just being in Cambridge in the sunshine.
Of revisiting a lot of things that were taken as given.
Oh, absolutely. It's extraordinary. I think I think you've described the world being at a T-junction where you can see it going in 2 different directions, and The way I view what's happening at the moment is that there's an interconnectedness to some of the things that are playing out. So, for example, climate change is creating new risks. It's creating new inequalities. It's creating new. It's driving immigration, for example, which is then pushing populist politics against immigration, driving people into populist parties. And then you've got the really big 100-year transition that we're in the middle of, which is getting off fossil fuels. And when you think about the money that's wrapped up in that system, it's never going to be a smooth transition. It's going to go forwards and backwards and be very volatile, because the countries that have benefited from the fossil fuels have now got an enormous amount of power. And traditionally, we would say that would have been Saudi and Russia, who were then essentially bad actors in the collaborative effort to solve climate change. And unfortunately, now you have to add the US into that triumvirate, because they are a fossil-driven economy. They've got more reserves. They're the largest exporter of fossil fuels now in the world. And my worry is that this desire to hold back progress, to stay with the fossil fuels because that's what we know, the inner conservatism of perhaps the financial markets, the capital investors, the industry, means that they've found lots of stories they tell themselves that are plausible but not right. You know, the physics does not align with it. But you can say, as the new Secretary of Energy has said, oh, climate change is just it's just a side effect of modernity. We just have to get used to it. And that so mischaracterizes the risk, and is so glib, and that I think it's all born out of, this is the way the world works, this is how we make money, and we can't imagine it a different way. Now, set against that, you've got what's happening in China and India and Southeast Asia, where they don't have fossil fuel reserves. They've moved into a state where they see the promise of electrification and electricity as the engine of growth. And I think you've got these two world orders now. It's been described as the kind of petro-states versus the electro-states, and who will come out on top. Where the US lands is anyone's guess, I think, at this stage.
So let's take an easy one, Canada.
Yes.
Okay, because that's a fascinating natural experiment going on now. So tell us a little bit about how you see what's happening in Canada.
So, I mean, Mark Carney, who I'm sure you're a good friend of, famously, here, as Governor of Bank of England, got very involved in transparency of data around financial markets as far as climate risk was concerned, and done a lot to try and raise awareness. One of the first things he did on election, becoming Prime Minister, was to scrap the carbon tax. He's kept it on some parts of the economy, but not on the public. But also then said he's going to try to get Canada to be more integrate its grids. He wants to see transmission. He wants to see electrification, but he's not going to turn his back on the tar sands and the unconventional oil and gas that Canada brings to market. So he's going to be straddling these two worlds. My concern, I guess, is that he's now given ground on a carbon tax to try and put Poilievre's populist government to bed, but it won't stop there. They'll keep going until he will get a lot of pressure to abandon the more progressive aspects of his policy and stick with the fossil. Whether he can, I hope with his friends in other parts of the world, he'll be able to continue on the path of, probably what he'll do is try and get the economics of the clean to beat the dirty.
So what advice would you give him?
That's what I'd say. I'd say stay the course, make sure you focus on building out the clean, and whether that's transmission, more hydro renovations, more nuclear. Canada's got some fantastically well-proven nuclear technologies. And then interconnecting. There's a great interconnection project, actually, which takes Canada and brings it into Scotland, believe it or not. And that project would be an amazing signal that Europe and Canada see the future. And the future is electrons and more interconnectedness. And I also would say go talk to Claudia Sheinbaum in Mexico, who is a climate scientist, and a female president who's trying to, she's deftly handling this situation north of her borders. The two of them together, coupled with all the other people in Europe who see the future as clean and green, that I think there could be a powerful alliance there. Okay,
so you described the world in terms of two blocks, if you like. I know it's much, much more complicated than that. We discussed a little bit solving, or at least addressing, the climate crisis in terms of game theory. And the three things we agreed on is, one is that this is a collective problem. Two is there's a collective responsibility to address it. And three is you only can do it through a cooperative game, through cooperation.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
So if you look at these three conditions right now,
they're not looking good, are they?
they're not looking good.
Yeah. But then don't forget the Trump effect is quite odd, right? Because I think we all thought maybe that the Australian government was going to flip, right? They were going to get rid of Albanese and go to the right. And then because of Trump, it's almost certain now that Albanese, well, we'll see, won't we, in a few days, that the Labour incumbent government will get returned. Because generally speaking, Trump has had such a galvanising effect in terms of people not wanting that chaos in their home nation, in their country. Similar with Carney. Polyev was well ahead in the polls, and now suddenly we're getting a climate leader who's got a fantastic understanding of global economics. Why? Because you can see that's not what's happening in the US right now, and there's a response and a reaction to it. So there's another form of multilateralism emerging where it's almost the US being isolated and everyone else realising actually this is too big a risk for us to take.
Okay, so problem is quite a few people are following the US. But even if the US were isolated, could you significantly address the climate crisis?
Well, the US's emissions continue to go down, even with Trump. In fact, during the last Trump presidency, you saw coal coming off because the switch out to natural gas. It's a little known fact, but solar and wind in the US now produces more electricity than coal for the first time in hundreds of years. That's just past that threshold. Texas, the kind of powerhouse of the energy economy in the US, is a huge investor in wind and solar and is now investing in nuclear. So the desire to invest in clean is still there, and partly it's because of security concerns, partly it's because ultimately these fossil fuels do not last forever. There will be a bust cycle at the end of this, and anyone with a longer term view wants to see something more sustainable. And then wind and solar plus batteries is just cheaper. And if you're building a data center and you want access to energy quickly, yes, you can throw in a gas turbine while you're building it, but ultimately it will be faster and more sustainable to put solar panels in your batteries. And that we're breaking records all the time in terms of how much solar can go in, how quickly. And it's the whole way that we make electricity is changing very fast. And the US is part of that. The sort of performative nature of the politics in the White House, whilst it's scary, and I'm not trying to belittle it or downplay it, and actually there's lots of conversations happening amongst the Democrats in the US who are very concerned about the breakdown of the rule of law, martial law being, there's lots of scenarios being played out which are very scary. But ultimately the US is a very federated, the states have a lot of power. The Constitution was written by the states for the states. They have a president who seems to be acting beyond the parameters of the law, but how long he'll be allowed to do that, I don't know. I think there'll be.
But you sound more hopeful about our climate future than the average person is right now.
Yeah, because I can see the data, and I can see, yes, on one hand, parts per million still rocketing up, but the transition that we're in, which is a 100-year transition, is well underway.
And this notion is we're going to hit critical
tipping points
too early. The data isn't consistent with where we believe the tipping points are.
Well, actually, what's happening is the impacts are coming faster, which is actually a good thing, because we're very bad as humans doing things that are important, but I think I got this from you, important but not urgent, right? We're good at the urgent and important, and we're pretty good at knowing what not to focus on because it's unimportant and unurgent. But when it's not urgent and important, we're terrible. And actually, the fact that things are happening that I would never have thought of in my lifetime already means that we are going to be forced to act. And I mean, the fact, when I was learning about climate change, I didn't have on my list, most of the boreal forests of the world will be on fire during your lifetime. That these things are quite off the scale, and that will force a reaction. So I'm not saying it's a good thing it's happening faster, but there'll be a corresponding reaction. And as I think a colleague of yours has said at Allianz, the insurance industry has been totally sort of broadsided by this, by the sheer number of impacts and with the severity. And we're not we're an inventive species. We're not lemmings. We're gonna apply our ingenuity. We're gonna keep adapting and keep inventing, and we've got capitalism, which actually as a force of change can build and do things very fast if it applies its mind to it. And it's not rocket science, literally not rocket science.
So if today you went back to your advocacy days,
Yeah.
You're in your mid-20s, you're just starting out.
Yeah.
What position would you take?
Well, depending on who'd have me. Back in those days. I mean, I would. Currently, I think there's a lot of unknowns that are out there in the science of climate change, and they range from how is the biosphere going to respond? How is human biology going to respond? And we are just realizing AI is by far and away the most exciting thing that's out there in terms of our, ability to do analytics. But when it comes to the wet sciences, the life sciences, the biology and the ecosystems that we live in, we know next to nothing, and I find that fascinating. So I think I'd be looking more into we know man-made emissions are causing climate change, but what we are very unclear about is what's the biosphere going to do, what's the natural world going to do in response. So I think I'd be drawn into, given my love of nature, I'd probably be drawn into studying how mycorrhizal fungi are going to respond in elevated temperatures, or something that's very kind of to get into the weeds of that question. How adaptive is nature? We assume that it's going to be put at great risk. But actually, what we're learning about genetics and epigenetics and the complexity of how different traits are able to even cross between species now, maybe it's more adaptive than we realise, and maybe we have a shot at enhancing that natural sink.
Are you afraid that people will use this as an excuse not to do enough now?
They already are. There's no more that you can do. No, everyone's already used all the excuses for inaction they can. And I think people will still find new excuses not to do things. But the really great thing is on the fossil side, you can make money doing the right thing now. The incentives are aligned. It's no longer needing a lot of government involvement or diktats or interventions. There's a momentum there which is coming from the capitalist system, where if you can make money from doing something faster and cheaper and better, why wouldn't you?
Okay, so let me generalize this as a final question. I'm going to open it up. Looking forward, and as a parent, okay, what gives you greatest hope, and what do you worry about most?
I think what gives me greatest hope is just that human trait towards solving problems. That as a species, that's probably our defining feature, is that we adapt and we get better and we learn and we keep moving on. And that's, therefore, we will, I hope, rise to the challenge. And that includes in the way that we run our financial markets and the way we run our governments and the way we run our energy systems. I think there's just going to be a lot of innovation and change. What worries me most is this great unknown about how fragile or resilient the biosphere is, and do we have enough data? When you go digging into... Well, actually, I wanted to ask you a question, because I remember reading about in PIMCO, you had this shadow investment committee, or at least maybe two shadow investment committees, where your job was to test the prior assumptions to ensure that you weren't just overlooking something. That is not how climate science is currently done. I fear we're working off sparse data. There's far too much consensual belief in models. The models are too similar. There's not enough orthogonal thinking. There's not enough, red teaming of what if scenarios. And I'd love to know how we could borrow some of those. In the face of uncertainty, how do you make yourselves more resilient? And I think that's what worries me, is we're not doing that. We're not tracking the right things, we're not paying attention, and we're not taking a risk-based approach.
Yeah, that's an example of using structure to help on cognitive diversity.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you will lose cognitive diversity if you don't have something that forces you on that.
Yeah.
I know I said I'm going to open up on a question, but one last one from my part. Okay, living in California.
Yes.
What's that like? And when you see the UK, what are you thinking now?
Well, there was a moment at the start of the year where we had a decision to make, whether we stay in California. I took a 2-year leave of absence to be there with my husband, and we took our family. And we had to decide whether we were coming back or not. I don't know. Actually, my fellowship here, which very grateful and honoured to be doing this, was interrupted because I was meant to be coming in December and I fell ill. And I went back from here, and in January we had to make this decision. And maybe I was coloured by the fact that last time I was here, it was miserable and I was ill, and we decided to stay. And at that time as well, the craziness hadn't started. It was still quite a calm period. So we're staying in California. The reasons are mainly to do with family reasons. That I have a wonderful family. My daughter in particular is thriving in this wonderful state school system of California, where you may call it woke, but it's actually just very nurturing, and it's a wonderful environment to grow up in, and it's very outdoors, and there's nature everywhere. It's incredibly young country. It's a very wild and so vast. I mean, that's what you don't realise when you're living over here, how crowded and relatively compact Europe is compared to the US. So I'm loving that expansiveness and the American spirit of very can-do attitude. So,
and what are you missing in the UK?
The spring flowers and the wonderful architecture and the history. I mean, just wandering around the college the last day has been, I've really missed that. Are
you more upbeat about the UK or more worried about the UK compared to when you left?
Well, I mean, obviously we saw a change of government. I mean, it couldn't have got much worse. I mean, partly why we went to California when we did was I was, again, slightly burnt out by this feeling of, oh my goodness, can it get any more ridiculous? And then the change of government, of course, was fantastic from my perspective. Now, have they lived up to everyone's expectations? Are they being bold enough? Are they being brave enough? Probably not. It's a difficult time, right? I look at it and I think, I wish the relationship with Europe was clearer. I feel it looks very small and likely to be buffeted by big global trends. Perhaps my view is that it's my home, I love it, I want it to do well, and there's nowhere like it in terms of diversity of landscapes and history and people, but it does feel like it needs friends in this world.
Okay, we're going to open up to your question, and I'm going to open up by calling on Lord Eatwell. John, you heard what Bryony had to say about the House of Lords. Yeah. Give us a little bit your perspective.
Well, yes, I mean, it's a strange place, but I think I wanted to ask Bryony a question.
Okay, go ahead.
Her experience in the House of Lords.
Very good, very political diversion, by the way, very well done.
Which is that, as you said, Nigel Lawson was a great leader of the anti-climate change direction, But Nigel Lawson was a clever man. I mean, I clashed with him a lot, but I respected Nigel Lawson. And Andrew Turnbull is also of the same group, right? A graduate of this university, of Christ College, who went on to become the head of the civil service. He is also in this anti-climate change direction. So what was the most difficult argument that they put forward that you had to deal with?
Well, actually, it was really interesting because they would make very strong arguments that the cure that was being prescribed was worse than the symptoms we were trying to solve. That this desire to control and force a particular technology through would be counterproductive. And I found that hard to counter because actually I shared some of those concerns. Because I felt we run the risk of civil servants or governments picking winners and that the market isn't as involved. Because these are free marketeers, these people who believe the market will get there in the end. I wanted broad-based signals and alignment of incentives that would allow the right technologies to come through. But what I suspect Nigel and many others were worried about was they were just being told, no, the answer is this and only this, and it doesn't matter the cost, we're going to do it. And so I found those arguments about too much intervention, too much of a license to try and be a nanny state and control too many things, hard to counter because I was also slightly concerned that we could go down that route. Yeah.
And I was intrigued about your story of the link between Canada and Scotland.
Yeah.
Because after the Icelandic banks collapsed, I was actually helping the Central Bank of Iceland put the banking system back together. So I learned quite a lot about Iceland. And of course in Iceland, energy is free. I mean, it's just totally free. And there is a project being put forward by the Icelanders to connect Iceland to the British grid. And it's helped by the fact that the Faroe Islands are almost exactly halfway. So you can have your booster station in the Faroe Islands and it could connect into the British grid. The only problem about this, especially, I mean, the problem used to be the loss of power through the actual transmission mechanism, but apparently that is dramatically less now. But the only problem is that every now and again Iceland blows up.
Yes.
I mean, Iceland has been completely evacuated 3 times in the last 200 years, where everybody had to leave. And if you're an Icelander, on your little identity card, it says either Norway or Denmark. And that's where you go when the island is evacuated. It's already agreed. So there's this source of energy which is totally free, the thermal energy in Iceland. But the price you pay is, of course, the volcanoes and the thermal activity. And Iceland, every now and again, blows up.
Yeah.
So that's the problem with this Canadian connection across to Scotland from Iceland.
Well, because John, I assumed that that's what they would do. They would do, Canada into Greenland, into Iceland, Faroe Islands. But no, it's actually just Canada to UK with one giant cable, where they're not even, because it's a straighter line or it's shorter or it costs less, literally just lying it on the ocean floor. And I mean, I think the longest cable in the world is like 4,000 kilometres. This would be, I don't know, or double, triple that. But there's nothing inherently engineering, if from an engineering perspective, that would stop you from doing it. Now, anyway, the other issue I'm sure you found with the Icelandic one was that it would push the prices up of Icelandic energy, right? And they weren't that happy about that, because ultimately you'd be then tied to a more expensive market. But,
yes, that's true.
Yeah. Anyway, I find these cabling projects fascinating. That's, part of what I think. And again, China, HVDC cabling, it's all been Chinese innovation.
The project is to get solar power from Morocco.
Yeah, up to the UK.
Okay, questions. Come on, don't. Is that a hand up over there? No? Don't be shy. Go ahead.
Thanks so much.
And we should all introduce ourselves so that Bryony knows who's asking her the question.
So Basman, I'm a bi-fellow in politics and sociology. So I share this interest in democracy and climate. So I was wondering to what extent you think actually the democratic system that we have is able to deal with climate change, because I cherish your optimism, but at the same time, what we see also is an increasing state capture and authoritarianism, and it seems not necessarily that kind of democracy is on the upbeat at the moment globally, and also connected to that, a lot of the right-wing authoritarian forces have picked climate as one of their pet issues, like after the Climate Change Act came into force, right? There was only 2013 roughly that was become one of the main issues. So what do we need to do about democracy as well, and are the current institutions fit for purpose, fit for climate change in particular?
Yes, I mean it's fair. I mean I am naturally optimistic by bias, but there are dark days when I think this is all going to go horribly wrong before it gets better. And arguably, what's playing out in the US is part of that descent into a fear-based narrative that leads everyone to focus inward and to look for some sort of strength in an autocratic leader, and rule of law and democracy is not needed. And they will be using examples like China as an example of where we're too soft, we're too liberal, we should be much less. I mean, whether or not Trump actually stands for a third term is going to cause this constitutional crisis in the US, and that's where we're at today, right? We're discussing that, so it is vulnerable. But it's something we talked about just earlier. There's this other layer now of governance that's not explicit. It's not democratic, but there's a check on the excesses of nation states. If you saw the Liz Truss moment of glory where she kind of came forth and then destroyed the economy and then got rid of, I sort of that point, I didn't know anything about the bond market, but it seemed that there was something in the financial system was a brake on these excesses. And we've seen the same thing happen in the US, where Trump's kind of excesses have been, he's not been able to see through what he wants to do, because there's been this very, it's almost a hive mind of financial actors in an uncoordinated way have said, no, we're pulling back. Now, that's not a democratic system, but it arises from a system in which the general feeling is that collaboration and openness is where we should be going. And I don't have an answer for whether our institutions are perfectly capable of this, but there are examples of multilateralism still surviving, where we as a species come together, discuss, collaborate, and do the right thing in the long term. They're not always the most obvious places, but they exist. And actually, a good example is we've just seen the shipping industry, weirdly, which is a representative body that's all nation states are represented, even the smallest islands are represented, and they've just passed a new law that's going to see the shipping industry take climate change seriously for the first time. And those institutions, which are very old UN bodies from the 50s, which were really designed to facilitate trade and economic growth, have actually shown themselves to be relatively slow moving but quite resilient. And I think there's probably more of those sorts of sectorally specific, get a job done kind of entities out there than you'd realise. From an actual electoral process of getting the populace to follow and vote for the right people, there's a big problem of information, and we're in a post-truth environment where everyone seems to be able to make up the truth as they go along, and I worry that needs another coming together in some form to say, what are the rules? What are going to be the rules with which society tries to keep itself informed and grounded in actual facts? And that hasn't emerged yet, but the problems are growing. AI will exacerbate them, I suspect. So we can imagine that there'll be a counteracting measure where we do try to put some rules in place. Does that in any way give you any... I mean, don't want to be glib, but I do think we're in a period of change, so things are going to emerge out of this for that. And people, like the people in this room and people who come through these halls, will have a help in shaping. We can make the future. I do fundamentally believe that nothing's preordained. We make the future that we want, so we just have to do that collectively in the face of strong resistance, but it will come through.
Okay, we have time for one more question. No, I'm going to ask you to take two at the same time. Yeah. Go ahead.
James Renton, fellow in medicine. Naive question: What should we be worried about pinch points in supply and controlled supply, particularly around copper, lithium, these technologies that are also finite that we would depend upon for clean?
Yeah. So
hold on.
Second question. Yeah.
Go ahead, please.
I'm an environmental policy student here at Queen's. I was just wondering, you talked about how maybe the Starmer government hasn't come through with its climate promises as hoped, and with the announcement that scientists can go ahead looking into more solar geoengineering, I was wondering what you think about investing in these technologies we might not be certain of as a kind of alternative to doing what we already know we can do to reduce emissions. Excellent.
Right. So on the supply chain issue, it's really interesting. And tomorrow, actually, I'm going to be interviewing Andrew Forrest at Fortescue Metals, who's an Australian miner, and I'm going to be asking him some of these questions. But what's emerging, it seems, is that these pinch points are pinch points because there's been no real concerted effort to find them, and that once we start looking, we find these commodities. And rare earths isn't really a description of how sparsely available they are. It's more just that they're rare in their abilities. So it's a misnomer in some ways. But copper is it's ubiquitous. Obviously, where it's concentrated isn't, but it's very recyclable. So whereas with fossil fuels, you go to great effort to get them out of the ground, refine them, and burn them. It's a once-through system. With copper, it nearly always stays in circulation. So you're adding to the global reserves each time you find a new deposit, and it keeps going round. So lithium is similar, and lithium is a very abundant element. There isn't an actual, there's a time lag issue in that to get a mine operational, especially in the West, you need 5 to 10 years of groundwork. But that's, once prices rise, people start to take an interest, and so there's now much more. In California now, they're starting to get their lithium. They're looking at their local deposits. Nevada has started opening up lithium mines, so that this feeling of independence, energy independence, is actually meaning that more investment's going in. So I'm not too concerned about that. Geoengineering, actually, next week I've been invited by a friend of mine who runs an environmental school in Harvard to attend a geoengineering summit in South Africa, and I ummed and ahed, and I thought I'll go because of my natural curiosity mainly, and I thought, well, it is something I want to fully get to the bottom of and understand the risks. Last time I looked at it was probably about 5 or so years ago, and most of the talk was about the moral jeopardy of, well, if we allow people to think we can just fix it, it's going to be bad for mitigation. I think that now that the pace of the impacts and this unfortunate effect that we've got now, where we've taken sulfur out of our combustion of fossil fuels largely, so because of catalytic converters and desulfurization equipment, especially in shipping and coal, we've essentially taken out the reflective dust that was emitted with carbon dioxide. So we've made the whole thing a whole lot worse. So we failed to act on climate change, we acted on acid rain at the wrong time, and now the removal of those sulfur particles has made climate change worse. So in a sense, what scientists in geoengineering are saying is, well, okay, we did that mad global experiment, perhaps now's time to just at least allow ourselves the opportunity to explore what it would look like to actively put the sulfur back, and if not sulfur, then some other inert piece of chemistry which is temporary. And for my mind, then it's a little bit like the nuclear conversation. It's a balancing of risks. And if you think CO2 persists in the atmosphere for 1,000 years, a bit of sulfur experimentation, which will fall to the, where it's not permanent, but it may allow us to see if we can buy ourselves some time, and it might enable us to do some local, regional cooling. So there's the sulfur particle, atmospheric sulfur injection is one. Then you've got cloud brightening, which is essentially trying to seed clouds over the ocean to keep the ocean cool. And there, Australia's in the lead because they are going to lose their reef if they don't do something quite urgent. And the pace of time it's going to take for us to transition the energy system is too slow for the coral reefs. So I think you are going to see more effort put into that. And I will just end with an anecdote, because this is why I love California. I turned up at my daughter's elementary science fair, didn't even get through the door, and the first stall was a father whose sons are in my daughter's class, who is currently throwing up weather balloons and letting sulfur particles out in the atmosphere and selling carbon credits. I was like, oh my goodness, are you allowed to do that? He said, I don't know, but I don't care, no one's going to stop me. So I was like, okay. So that is the weirdness of America, right? That there's this can-do attitude, and he was very, very scientifically literate in his argumentation as to why he should be allowed to do this. And so it seems almost certain this is going to be a feature of how we tackle this crisis. We should definitely not use it as an excuse to carry on. But wouldn't it be nice for our children and our children's children if we had some sense that we could buy ourselves some time? Because we do need a time machine if we're truthful, because we're starting too late.
Okay, on that, before I ask you to join me in thanking Baroness Worthington, next week, same place, the Fireside Chat will be with Indra Nooyi. Indra Nooyi is known for her role at Yale University, for the advice she gives to lots of governments, for having been the CEO of PepsiCo for a very long time, a best-selling author. But the most interesting thing about Indra Nooyi is how she got there, coming from a very small Indian village. So we will have her in conversation, and the good news, not with me, but with Anna. So that's next week. Join me in thanking Baroness Worthington. You've given us hope, much more hope than I had in the beginning, I must say, earlier today.
Oh, that's good.
So thank you for that. And it's wonderful to have you as an honorary fellow and to be able to interact with you much more in future.
Well,
thank you very much.
Well, thank you.